Welcome, everyone. We are having our latest Human Rights, Technology, and Science webinar series at Movement Engaged. Movement Engaged is a research hub of the Center for Social Science Research at George Mason University. We today have a very special topic, Bangladesh in Transition, Navigating Democratic Reform, Digital Governance, and the Way Forward. We have a very special group of panelists as well, and I will be introducing them in just a moment. Beforehand, I want to remind everyone that this webinar will be recorded. We will also be posting it later on our website. Today, we will have two panels. This will be a 2.5 hour session with a break at 11 for 5 minutes. Our first panel is Political Transition, Democratic Reform, and Digital Law and Civil Liberties. Mohammed Saimam Reza Takluder is going to be on this first panel. He's a prosecutor, Assistant Attorney General of International Crimes Tribunal in Bangladesh. He's also a senior lecturer now on leave at the School of Law at Accra University. He's an advocate and district and sessions judge court in Dhaka, Bangladesh, and a former member of the AI Working Group and the Hannah Arendt Center for Politics and Humanities. We will also have on our first panel Sabhanaz Rashid Dia, who prefers to be referred to as Dia, so I will not be just calling Dia by her last name. She's executive director and at the Tech Global Institute and a visiting policy fellow at the University of Oxford. The Tech Global Institute is a tech policy nonprofit for advancing equity of global majority communities on the internet. Previously, she was the head of public policy for Bangladesh Meta, and Dia brings nearly 2 decades of experience at the intersection of technology policy, international development, and human rights. After a short break from 11 to 11:05, we'll also have a second panel, Building a Rights-Based Digital Future, Infrastructure, Accountability, and Tech Governance. On this panel, we'll have Christabel Randolph, who is not here at the moment, but will be joining us. She's Associate Director at the Center for AI and Digital Policy. We also have Dina van der Heest, Program Operations Manager at Article 19. Dina is Program Operations Manager in the global team. Digital Article 19 has been working at the intersection of technology and human rights, engaging in multilateral and multi-stakeholder governance mechanisms to support the adoption of rights-respecting technical policies, as well as rights-respecting standards in internet infrastructure. She's worked to build evidence on the impacts of internet infrastructure design, development, and deployment decisions on the human rights of people and communities. She's also worked to strengthen and facilitate the diversity of civil society voices within internet governance policy decision-making building. And we're very happy to have her here today. And then finally, we have Samaya Anjum, who's a Policy and Communications Fellow of the Global Networks Initiative. Samaya is a journalist and researcher focusing on technology, human rights, and forced migration. She has worked extensively on data protection, press freedom, and disinformation within nonprofits, media, and government. Currently, Samaya is a Policy and Communications Fellow, as I mentioned, at the Global Network Initiative, and holds a degree in politics and government from Sciences Po Paris and Trinity College Dublin, and a master's in public policy from Central European University in Vienna, where she is right now. So this is just an amazing panel, and we're very happy to have you all here today. As we proceed, I think I will have some Q&A. Usually in these Zooms, people will put their questions in the chat. I'm asking our audience to use the Q&A function instead because the chat won't be working and we won't get your questions. Jeba Humaira, who is a PhD student at George Mason University in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology, will be our moderator today. She's going to be asking questions of our panelists. So this will be not just presentations on these panels, but it'll be more of a dialogue. And I will be asking questions from the audience. So please ask them as you go. And if you have a question for a specific panelist, make that known as well. So Jeba, who was largely responsible for organizing this fantastic panel, I will give you the floor.
Thank you so much, Dr. Dell, for this kind introduction and for your support and guidance throughout the process. This webinar comes at a very pivotal moment in Bangladeshi history, marked by the fall of the last Awami League regime and the formation of an interim government. It's a time filled with both uncertainty and possibility. So my first question is for Mohammad Saimon Raja Talukdar. I believe many of us eager to hear your insights on this. What are the social, political, and economic factors that led to the fall of the Awami League and the rise of the interim government? And more broadly, why is this moment politically significant in the context of Bangladesh and its democratic backsliding and the systematic exclusion of civil voices?
Okay, thank you. It is always very easy, but at the same time, tough as well to comment on the political issues. First of thing, I'm not the politician. Okay, so I'm just the academic, and right now I'm serving as a public prosecutor. So I will not comment on the sub judice matter, but as a conscious citizen of Bangladesh, and also as I experienced different things during the July Revolution last year. So I will share my experience, like why the things happened. The first thing that I would say, in a country, particularly a country in Global South, when the process of political transition is destroyed, or somehow that process has been ousted either through, I would say, judicial coup, or through any other extreme political ideology, then at one point of time, the government tend to become fascist or authoritarian. I think it's universal. It's not only true for Bangladesh. It happened in the course of history. The same thing that we have seen in Bangladesh, because the last government, the Awami League government that was in power for more than 15 years. But initially it came through a general election. But then subsequently, the people of Bangladesh experienced three questionable elections in 2014, in 2018, and 2024. And the election in 2014, it was publicly known or renamed as Autopass election, because there are 300 constituencies in Bangladesh, and if any party gets 151 seats, then that party comes into the power, because of the 151 is the majority out of 300. And even before the election day, because there was it was boycotted by the major political parties, 153 members in the 153 constituencies, there were no other candidates except the ruling party candidate. So even before the election happened, the Awami League is already elected unofficially or technically. So it was publicly known as Autopass election. And in 2018, there are allegations that even before the election day, before the at night, the ballot box were sorted out. It was filled with ballot papers, etc. So many people in Bangladesh, they named it as Lailatul election, the nighttime election. Okay, so there is the public. People do the mockery with this name. And the last one, the latest one in 2024, we call it dummy election, because there are many dummy candidates. They were actually brought by the Awami League. That was the allegations. So when you see this series of very questionable, undemocratic mechanism in disguise of democratic election, then the government actually starts ignoring the people's demands and it starts reacting. Even it could be a very legitimate issue. For an example, you want the like equal access or equal opportunity in government job. Even if it is a legitimate demand of the people of Bangladesh saw the reactions by the then Awami League, because that eventually that government turned into a fascist government. Why I am saying fascist government, not only the authoritarian, because it was not the political leaders or the supreme leaders. They created an ecosystem, the ecosystem of some of the cronies, those who were the beneficiaries of that corrupted political systems. And then at one point of time, the people of Bangladesh started seeing that it is not always the political leaders, even the corrupted bureaucrats, the corrupted people from the defense, the corrupted people from the judiciary, for their vested group interest, they were systematically and widespreadly violating the human rights of the people everywhere. I can give you the example, like the systematic and widespread nature of extrajudicial killing and enforced disappearance that occurred in Bangladesh. The gross violation of the judicial rights in the judiciary. Even there was an incident that the Chief Justice of Bangladesh had to leave the Bangladesh at gunpoint. That incident also happened in 2017. And also we have seen the influence of the bureaucrats, like every year the bureaucrats had their national assemblies and they used to place different undemocratic demands. For an example, because of the bureaucrats' pressure, the government had to enact Sharkari Chakrijibi Ain, Government Service Providers Act, something like that. And there was a clause that even if a government officer or government servant there is an allegation of criminal offense, without the permission of the concerned government department, that person cannot be arrested. And that clearly puts the general citizen or the ordinary citizen of the people as a second-class citizen. So we have seen this kind of vested interest was served and created and entertained by the government. So that's why I'm saying that it was eventually turned into a fascist regime. And then at one point of time, I think it becomes saturated. And that's why the young people, particularly Gen Z, Generation Z, they reacted because it was a bubble, and then they reacted, and it was a spontaneous action. I would say spontaneous reaction from the people, because when in the July we were in the field, we were protesting against the government action, like the law enforcement agencies brutally and indiscriminately attacked and fired on the unarmed protesters, who were mostly young kids. We have seen people from all segments of the society, from all classes, from all professions, etc., etc. Even I was academic, and I actually was in the street with my students, and I've seen one student shot dead in front of my eyes. The situation was that bad. So I think those were the reasons that when you stop and you diminish the process of political transition, eventually you lose your democracy. I will stop now here.
Thank you, Simon, for laying out the socio-political landscape and providing the historical depth of this transition and also the recent movement. Now, I would like to turn to both you and Dia with a broader question on legal reform. Bangladesh is undergoing a critical period of legal and political transformation, and we have seen that there has been a recently proposed Cybersecurity Ordinance 2025 on table, introduced by the interim government, which was intended to reform. However, there has been some criticism regarding its lack of transparency and its apparent reproduction of centralized control patterns reminiscent of previous regimes. So I'm curious to know from your perspective, Dia, you are a data science and technology expert, and Simon, you are a legal scholar. I'm curious to know what is at stake for digital rights and accountability in this moment. How can the government balance national security imperatives with freedom of expression and data protection while also effectively preventing disinformation and misinformation given the country's history of digital repression? And finally, what would a truly rights-based and accountable legal framework for cybersecurity and digital governance look like in the context of Bangladesh? Since this is very broad, I would like to request you to have like 10 minutes each for this question. Dia, would you like to go first? Then we can hear from Simon.
Yep, sounds good. Thank you, Ziva, for having us on this panel. I think, Simon, we were really good sort of scene setting in terms of what was happening in Bangladesh, and largely in terms of the broader sort of electoral and democratic rights sort of space. I think just it kind of broadly also expands to economic spaces in terms of money being laundered out of the country in sort of pretty much every single sector, from national security to economics to social safety net programming to your health, how COVID was managed and kind of what that led to and the kind of challenges that ensued. And I think in that kind of an environment, one of the, I guess, biggest what would I say? I mean, I guess missives are one of the biggest, I guess, factors of the Awami League regime was the fact that I think people oftentimes forgot what it's like to have their voice in different processes, because it was robbed of them in such broad daylight, from elections to being able to make simple demands to being able to say to being able to express what they want to online. I think it's been such a broad process that there's an entire generation that grew up not knowing how to ask for what they rightfully deserve. And I think in many ways that I've always found that sort of factor conflated with how we think about our digital ecosystem, in the sense that I think historically people from the global south has never been part of digital sort of I guess consultation processes. Technologies have always been imposed on our populations. It was never through our consultations, through our choices. John, you teach technology and society, so definitely you recognize that the kind of elite capture and regulatory capture that has happened in the last decade is just extraordinary. And that's in parts of the world where technology is actually built and created and then spread across the rest of the world. And when you come to rest of the world, which itself is quite a derogatory term, there is literally no rights. There's no way for people to have a say in deciding, this is how I want that new tech to be designed for me. And that's not just social media and big tech, which is I think where a lot of the attention goes to. It's across the board, from your e-commerce websites to potentially, how the internet is even written, because majority of the language of the internet is in English, right? So inaccessibility and the fact that people historically has always had to deal with technology imposition, I think is a longer trend. I think if that sort of trend comes to a place like Bangladesh, where people are already robbed of their rights, I think that has a much wider effect in terms of, one, it's already imposed, and second, I think the government also gets away with that further imposition. And I think that's, I guess, a starting point how we think about digital rights in Bangladesh. Historically, I think, beyond some of the just that broader technical imposition. I think legal ecosystems have been quite concerning for Bangladesh as well. We did some work a couple of months ago that we looked into over 100 laws that have been passed in Bangladesh, and many are from colonial era, which was just continued, and that's unfortunately a relic of many global majority countries that continue to rob people of their rights. That is, from getting access to data, without any kind of procedural safeguards, all the way to being able to control what kind of speech you cannot say. It's quite interesting because some of the same language that was used during the British colonial period across the world, language now saying, you cannot say something because it distorts public harmony. I mean, public harmony remains to be an undefined term even today. We don't know what that means. I have no idea what public harmony means. I don't think the public can be in harmony in a democracy. So I think those are fundamentally, patterns that we saw being replicated even during the Awami League regime, but also exacerbated in 100 folds, right? So public harmony was anything from being able to say that I do not like how the building of this large public institution looks like, to, I do not like how men and women are engaging, in their domestic household. Like, it could be anything, right? So I think that sort of broad interpretation that starts actually has its roots in colonial laws and then extends to modern times and then finds its home in a very totalitarian regime and a space where people are historically robbed of their rights, really kind of put our entire digital ecosystem pretty much in a sort of backseat. And that also, we look at over 100 laws, and that cuts across internet shutdowns, surveillance, speech, competition, your access to basic services, how you access even government websites, access to right to information. You pick your bet on any democratic right, and there's a digital version of that, and that's going to kind of erode those rights. And I think that's the situation that we are kind of coming, I wouldn't say coming out of, but kind of that's that situation that has existed for a very, very long time. And so in that kind of a scenario where laws are sort of imposed left, right, and middle, I think one of the most draconian moments that I can recall was actually the Anti-Terrorism Act, which somehow has come to a complete full fold these days. But back in the day, I think many of the cases that we saw about enforced disappearances and extrajudicial killings that Sayam has spoken about was actually through false charges under the Anti-Terrorism Act. And many of the digital, in fact, repression that happened was also by actually tagging people as terrorists because they said something that somebody didn't like. Whether it was saying something I think Hindus and Muslims should live harmoniously, that could also be terrorism, to potentially having a slightly more vocal support for Islamic values and Islamic scholarship, even that was terrorism. So it's such a very, very broad interpretation. And I remember that law, I think, was passed in 2009, but Simon can hold me accountable to that because I don't recall the dates exactly. And that was actually from the first Awami League regime, which was they were elected in 2008, elected quote unquote, and then that law was kind of revised, amended, passed, and that I think in many ways set the scene for how far you can push the elasticity and how far you can push in terms of eroding and kind of imposing laws without any kind of safeguards, any kind of feedback. And I think eventually that led to Digital Security Act, that became Cyber Security Act, other laws like how your licensing regimes for telecom operators work, who can give takedown orders, for example, what kind of government services you can access through social safety net programs. Pretty much all of these various laws over time got changed. And we have seen a scenario where there has been multiple cases under various draconian laws, including what I think many of the audience may know about is the Digital Security Act, which became the most widely known repressive act in law in Bangladesh, which then got transitioned to Cyber Security Act, and multiple cases of people not being able to say anything. And we've also had instances where, for example, the Pornography Act was used indiscriminately and against people. I remember a scenario where a woman came and said she's unable to sell certain women's products because that was seen as pornographic. So it's as random as that. So in that kind of a context, I think the government, when the interim government first came into the fold, one of the biggest demands on the table was how do we withdraw all of these cases that were falsely charged against innocent people, and they ended up in jail for it, and their entire lives have been destroyed, right? They don't have any kind of recourse. And that, I guess, there's been lots of commitments from the interim government in terms of withdrawing some of the cases. I believe some of the cases have been withdrawn, some are still pending. It's hard to get that kind of data because transparency as a binding condition for democracy somehow has been eroded. Somehow people still think they can get away with it, but I think that level of transparency has never been practiced in Bangladesh, and I think asking for that transparency, again, I think people have kind of forgotten what to kind of ask for. And as part of that sort of reform process, we've seen the cyber protection ordinance being kind of proposed. It was approved quite recently as well, and well, passed again. It's not passed on an official gazette, but so there's that sort of legal aspect to it. But anyway, and we've also seen very similar patterns. There are certain good things. For example, certain categories of speech offenses have been removed. Certain kind of punitive measures have been sort of loosened up. So it isn't all bad, right? But I think there's also significant concerns, particularly from civil society now, who are particularly from the public now. And I think that it's encouraging to see that debate happening more and more, where there are still provisions that does centralize and consolidate state power. And that's extremely concerning because we are not just living under, this is an interim period. I think people oftentimes forget this is an interim period. There is going to be a political government, if not one, at some point. And Bangladesh has had a very rough history with political governments, right? So what happens when that government starts interpreting laws the way we have seen in the last 15, 16 years? There are provisions of the law that, for example, still has significant criminal liability provisions, again, a relic of the colonial era. So it isn't just individuals, their entire companies, their entire families can be charged under this law. So there's also these kinds of elements. And I think for me personally, one of the most concerning elements of this protection ordinance is the fact that it talks a lot about women's protection. And I think women's protection as a justification for bad laws is just an old trick in the book. We've seen it for so many times. So, but it's even more concerning the fact that women actually have not been consulted in this process, right? And I think, again, what does a consultation look like? And I started with this idea that people have kind of forgotten what their rights are. I think people in many ways actually, even now that we're in an environment where there's supposed to be allegedly, restructuring of rights, people are being able to say whatever that they want to say, and they are able to say whatever that they want to say because, they're not being taken to jail immediately for it. But I think we kind of have also forgotten what does a true public consultation look like. Public consultation isn't really, bringing your 5 friends and having a conversation. That's not a public consultation, right? It is really engaging the public, building transparency mechanisms, having a feedback loop, and actually having a conversation as you're developing the law so that people feel, their voices and their opinions are being factored into it. And I think we really haven't seen that level of public consultation for this particular law, which obviously raises quite a lot of concerns from a number of people across the communities. So we now have the cyber protection ordinance. I am very worried about what this law would mean for future political governments. I'm very concerned about the fact that, again, women has been put central to it, but actually their rights and their voices have been diminished in that process. So what does it actually mean for women's protections? And I think it also misses the point that many of the bad elements of the digital ecosystem, for example, overt or sort of unregulated data access or unlawful data access, or criminal liability provisions or certain kinds of speech offenses, those still exist in the Constitution. Those still exist in very old colonial laws like Code of Criminal Procedures. Those still exist in a number of old sort of law enforcement laws like Police Act and things like that. So when you have an entire ecosystem of bad laws and you have allegedly one trying to make a dent, I think that disconnect becomes quite clear. And I think that's something that also makes me quite worried. You asked me about what does the future hold. I think that's a much larger discussion. So I'm going to pause here, probably give it to Simon to kind of share his bit.
Excellent analysis. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so I was listening to Dia. Dia, Christabel, Samaya, and Dina, they all are very much expert and acquainted with the Bangladeshi laws and their loopholes and nuances. Still, I dare to share my thoughts on these policies. since the beginning of Bangladesh after the Liberation War of 1971, many of the I would say activists, human rights activists, or academics in Bangladesh, they do the critique that the constitution of Bangladesh itself failed to accommodate the thoughts of the different aspects of the society because it was written by some social elites. There is a critique, particularly the minority groups and their views were not accommodated in the first constitution of 1972. There is a critique. So when you start looking into the process of lawmaking in Bangladesh, the first question goes to the adaptation of the constitution itself. How the constitutional constituency was created. There are arguments and that it did not accommodate all the political parties or vested groups in the constitution making process. So there are arguments in favor of that and against that as well. But as the Dia said already, that we are still bearing the colonial legacies, particularly that very much bureaucratic structure and that secrecy in lawmaking process. That is the most problematic that I think, because even in the Awami League regime, at one fine morning, you suddenly discover that there is a draft of Cyber Security Act or draft of Digital Security Act. And government used to say that, yes, we discussed with the civil society members, but the civil society members whom we know, like Dia, Christabel, or Samaya, or Dina, we don't know who are those civil society members. It is also true that some of the civil society members or so-called civil society members, unfortunately, served the purpose of the fascist regime. There are some NGOs, we used to call them GONGO, Gongo, government organized NGOs. That is the fine term that we used to say. Any kind of draconian or repressive law that government used to draft, those NGOs used to organize sessions and they used to validate as a spokesperson of the government. And government used to take that defense that, yes, we shared and discussed things with those civil society members. So a part of the blame also goes to those so-called civil society members as well. And as I said, the secrecy in the lawmaking process, even I found that the law regarding cybersecurity or regarding internal governance or etc., one of the draft was drafted in a personal chamber of a former bureaucrat. Why? Because in Bangladesh, there is a trend that some of the international or globally renowned multinational NGOs or non-government institutions, they hire the former bureaucrats as their staff. And why? Because this is how they can have a kind of undue influence over the government, or at least because the government is not democratic government in past. So they used to take the help of those former retired bureaucrats to pass their message or to have their influences with those undemocratic governments. And like one bureaucrat used to refer the other bureaucrat as one as their staff. So it was a kind of like unholy group or trend that we also have seen. So this is how a very secret measure or process of lawmaking was adopted by the past undemocratic government of Awami League. The second thing is that if you talk about the cybersecurity, internet governance, or internet-related laws, etc., interestingly, the global war on terror policy has a lot to do with that. After the 9/11 of USA, our European and American friends came up with the idea to strengthen the capacity of the law enforcement agencies. As a theory, it sounds really nice. But what actually happened in Bangladesh, that initiated the militarization of the law enforcement agencies. The law enforcement agencies, like the police, received sophisticated softwares and hardwares, and those were like surveillance softwares and hardwares. And interestingly, some of those softwares and hardwares came as development aid. The taxpayers' money of the European citizens or North American citizens, those were spent to supply, to export surveillance softwares, but without ensuring any accountability, whether those surveillance softwares and hardwares are being used for extrajudicial killing and enforced disappearances or not. I really doubt whether they bothered about that or not, because I asked one of the ambassadors of a European Union, one of the European Union countries' ambassador, replied me that while at the export level, they do the all due diligence, but once the surveillance software and hardware reaches the destination country, what after that they do not monitor. So that also happened. And also it changed the characteristics of the law enforcement agencies from protecting civilians to combat terrorism with military grade weapons. And we already have seen during the July revolutions that how brutally and indiscriminately military grade weapons have been used against the unarmed student protesters who are civilians. And the crimes against humanity that happened during the July revolution in 2024 in Bangladesh. That is very unique in that sense that those protesters, they were not armed group. It was not any international armed conflict. It was an internal, I would say, civil protest. But the widespread and systematic pattern of the atrocities that will amount to crimes against humanity. So I think for the first time, the world will be watching that for any internal civil unrest, crimes against humanity happened by the political parties and also by the law enforcement agencies. Eventually, Bangladesh got specialized forces like Rapid Action Battalion, also SWAT, SPBN. Okay, so these kinds of things, and special forces from Europe and North America, they came and trained our law enforcement agencies. Why I'm saying this too? Because as Dia mentioned, the anti-terrorism issues were very much relevant to this, because when you got Digital Security Act, when you get Anti-Terrorism Act in 2009, those were mainly focusing on combating the terrorists. But the problem is that who are the terrorists? That has not been defined on those laws. So any political opponent, any different thoughts, any cyber dissidents, there are several examples that they have been subject to the judicial harassment. They have been subject to the enforced disappearance and extrajudicial killings. They have been subject to the torture and death and murder. So all those laws were security focused, not human rights focused. That's why we got Cyber Security Act. But if you would ask me, Simon, draft a law, I would draft Cyber Safety Act. I would never use the security word. I would use the human rights safety words. So even from the title of the law, we can understand the mentality, the objective and focus of the lawmakers. So it was a kind of like top-down approach, and it was fully focusing on state security, so-called national security, maintaining law and order situation, etc., without ensuring any kind of accountability of the government and also the law enforcement agencies. What is waiting for the future in Bangladesh? I would say it is a more like political question. In past, we've seen that the political question have been decided by the judiciary, and that created another political chaos that we do not want. The political question should always be solved by the political parties, should always be solved through a democratic process. So Bangladesh is now having an interim government, and Dia rightly pointed out, and I also agree that the interim government's task is to ensure a fair, free, fair, democratic transition. The main task lies on the democratically elected government that we will hopefully we will see in near future. Our focus should be it should be human rights centric, human centric. It should not be national security centric. National security is also one of the major concern, but that should come to ensure the human security, to protect, promote the human rights, etc., etc. So that should be the tone. And also another trend that we have seen in past, that whenever any policy regarding internet governance, cybersecurity, it was the tech community who took the lead. We understand that tech community or the business community in the tech sector, they have the resource or capacity, but the problem is that the human rights community or even a philosopher, even ordinary people, their voices were unheard on that process. Those policies were mainly centered into how to maximize profit, how to promote business, how to expand their business promotion, etc., etc. So that completely or mostly left the question of like human rights, question of morality, question of ethics. If you read the draft policy, AI policy that came out in 2024, if you read the national ICT policy in 2018, you will understand that the question of ethics and morality has not been touched. It was fully centered on securing the key point installation or critical information infrastructure of the governments, or it was fully centered onto the government, I would say, government agencies, etc., etc. So we have to avoid that trend. Lawmaking process is should be the very much part of the ordinary citizen as well. We understand that the business society, even we, the human rights activists, will take part. But a very ordinary citizen like a rickshaw puller, a farmer, even a day laborer should have saying in drafting the law. So I think that has to be echoed, that has to be understood by the future lawmakers of Bangladesh. Otherwise, the same vicious circle would be popping up again and again. Thank you. I'll stop now.
Thank you so much, both Dia and Simon, for unpacking the stacks of digital governance in Bangladesh and the complexities of reform at the current moment. I have one last question for Dia. We haven't been discussing disinformation and misinformation yet, but I was wondering, in recent months, we have seen there has been a noticeable rise in coordinated digital propaganda from Indian media outlets following the July 2024 movement in Bangladesh. And I know you have worked in this issue, so I was wondering, do you think this should concern the regulatory authority? And if yes, then how to strike a balance between combating propaganda without opening a leeway for arbitrary control over the free flow of information and freedom of expression?
Thanks, Jeva. Difficult question, because I think the whole world is dealing with mis and disinformation, and it's actually quite concerning that that work is also being challenged right now in parts of the world which has had a history of tackling these issues and supporting rights. So we are in a very difficult time, not just in terms of the information landscape itself and the complete capture of this through the private sector, but also in terms of the broader regulatory and geopolitical environment in the world, where this kind of work is also being put into a lot of question. And I think that's not, and I think that is a disservice to human rights and I guess decades of human rights work. But with that kind of context aside, I think in terms of mis and disinformation, one of the interesting elements of that is I think we've always had mis and disinformation in history. If you go back, all the way to Roman era, to even how in Bangladesh's history or the subcontinental history, how Babri mosque was kind of vandalized and broken down. I mean, that was also disinformation. It's rumor, it's propaganda, it's sort of information spreading from one group of people to another without any kind of proper sort of checks and balances. So I think this is a very old problem in many ways. We see sort of certain moments in which it escalates and spikes, but then essentially it is a perennial societal problem that you're not going to have a lot of accurate information going. And I think one of the ways in which sort of the technology ecosystem, or particularly large-scale companies have done is in many ways it has monopolized the information space where what is truth is now really, it becomes sort of questioned, right? You live in a post-truth world because everybody has their own sort of their windows into what does that truth look like. And it's interesting because I don't think we're in a moment of fact versus lies kind of a situation. I think we're largely in a moment of sort of narratives, right? So some of it is true, some of it is, you're like in that gray area. And human beings love existing in gray areas, and then you kind of take a slight side, or you take the other side. And you have this scenario where it's not all factually inaccurate, but there's a lot of misperceptions, misunderstandings, assumptions in that narrative that makes it dangerous and that makes it very concerning. And so coming to Bangladesh, I think Bangladesh has had that problem for a very long time. And we talk a lot about foreign manipulation, foreign disinformation. In European words, we call it FEMI. This body has existed even in the Awami League regime. I think we did not know a lot about it at the time because it was difficult to investigate on that. It was difficult to publish on that. And the government was actually supporting that. So state-sanctioned disinformation has been an element of Bangladesh for the last 10, 12 years, as soon as people figure out how to use technology, right? And so large-scale campaigns, propaganda, and for women, it was a lot of reputational harassment. We've done multiple investigations in 2024, 2023 that keeps demonstrating that how you have a network of actors, network of content providers who then very systematically spread information and spread false information and target specific groups of people. And these groups are not, a large part of them are state sanctioned, was stated by the Awami League, so they actually have their own people doing it. But also there are elements of where the India has done it, Pakistan has done it, China has done it, Iran has done it, Russia has done it. Everybody has had their little games of mis and disinformation, right? So we have a lot of evidence of that. I think now we're in a position where the government has taken up a more public position against it. They are now calling out the disinformation. I think that's the only difference, because now the government themselves are not spreading as much propaganda. There's still propaganda. It's a global majority government. It's a government. Government has their own set of propaganda to spread at any point. But with that aside, I think there's just a little bit more concern now. There's a little bit more public call out of the disinformation now. So in that kind of scenario, I guess your question is sort of how do we address this sort of information pollution that's happening right now? And I think a large part of it is actually not tackling the information pollution at all. I think it's really having a vibrant media ecosystem. Bangladesh's media ecosystem in the last, I think even since independence, has had lots of twists and turns, but a large part of media houses are owned by politicians or businesses. And that's also a phenomenon in the US, in Europe as well. But the idea of a public interest media has not existed in Bangladesh for a very long time. We don't have competition. You have a business person who owns it. There is no understanding of conflict of interest. There is no separation between the business team and the editorial team. And so you have a situation where the editorial team is disproportionately influenced and coerced by the business side of a news publication. And I think the US is now going through its own reckoning with its media environment. But I think we've faced that for a very long time. And in my mind, the only way to tackle bad information is to have credible and competitive media ecosystems where there's lots of independent newspapers, online, offline. There are independent radio stations. There's a wide range of information that people can go to, because right now trust in media has really fallen. So I think that's a starting point. I don't think, we can fact check our way out of this. I don't think we can FEMI investigate our way out of this. I don't think we can digitally forensics our way out of this, because even if you have that information, even if you do all of that, the scale at which it's operating, you as a researcher, you as a journalist will never be able to keep up. It's just extraordinarily difficult. That's one. Second, a lot of that responsibility falls on platforms themselves, and platforms have a very complicated way of defining what is truth, because a lot of the times, I remember even during my meta days, there were situations where somebody has made a rape allegation that, I was raped, or my neighbor was raped, or somebody was raped. And you have no way of understanding whether that was rape or not. So that's a very niche example, because that's a more complicated one. But then that expanded to other areas as well. And that becomes really challenging. And also, in many ways, many platforms have just terrible disinformation and misinformation policies. The enforcement is bad. The coordination is, there's profit mechanism around the coordination, because, you can buy ads, you can get ads, you can make money for the platform, you can make money for yourself. So there's a lot of monetary incentive that fuels the disinformation industry. And so there is not a lot of incentive for a platform, and that is unfortunate that they do not still have incentive to actually regulate and act on it with the scale and rigor that it should be done with, right? And so you have, on one hand, sort of, the people who are creating it, state sanctioned, FEMI, etc., they're kind of getting away with it. The second hand, the platforms who are not willing to act on it. And the third is, just the broader elite capture that has happened. In the sense, right now you're seeing, and even with the recent India-Pakistan sort of conflict, I mean, a huge amount of state sanctioned censorship has happened. And platforms have had to, and platforms have sort of sided with that side, because it made more business sense, because there are hostage laws in these countries, because, your staff is being harassed if they're not kind of complying. So there's a lot of elements of that. And I think we've reached a point in history where I don't think we can rely on sort of the private sector or the goodwill of governments to act responsibly. I think it has to fall on sort of more foundational democratic processes. It has to fall on the four estates functioning properly, your judiciary, your executives, your sort of media functioning in a way that is actually in service of the people. And I think it's really about, I mean, a lot of the discussion that I have now with my colleagues these days is less about digital and more about how do we actually reclaim democracy, and what does that discussion look like. So I guess to your point, Java, I think moving forward, I guess those are areas where I see a lot of opportunity, not so much in the digital space, but actually a lot more in the non-digital spaces, because once you have a thriving democratic ecosystem with a thriving media environment, I think a lot of the disinformation, I guess, gets tackled, because you have different outlets with different belief systems where you can go for different kinds of information.
Excellent. Thank you so much for your insight on propaganda and regulatory concerns. We are pretty much on time. We now have 10 minutes for audience question and answer for this panel. I would like to invite Dr. Dell to moderate this segment.
Good. Yeah, I don't see any questions in the Q&A at the moment, but I have some. So until I see some, I guess I'll start. So Dia, I want to pick up where you left off a bit there. I think there are some examples we can point to, even in India, for instance, in Kerala, where we see a democratization of platforms in the form of digital platform cooperatives. So you have cooperative principles that are integrated into the decision making on the platform. You see in some places an effort to expand rights from single entities to collective ownership, right, of this data. There are thinking of it as a public commonwealth. This data has value. I mean, Simon, you were referring to what I would describe as a kind of not only the surveillance technologies, but surveillance capitalism more broadly. And as these big tech companies come in and try to negotiate for expanding platforms for this long list of things you all so well discussed, it is very important that we seek some of these alternatives. They may be smaller scale, but there are ways to scale out, if not scale up, in the way that the business community often talks about it. So I wonder if you're seeing any of this kind of activity in Bangladesh. Is there? I mean, I don't want to. I do a lot of work in Myanmar also, and I don't like sort of comparing these nation states as separate units of analysis as though they're sort of separate containers. I think there's a lot of transnational flow of, you've already talked about the surveillance technologies flowing in the data itself. There's a rewriting of rules around data flows that's been happening, and but there are comparisons I think you can make across these countries, and the sort of authoritarian uh, governance that we see in Myanmar very much had an impact on Bangladesh. Of course, the flows of Rohingya across the border, forced flows. You saw Facebook and its lack of content moderation contributing to a genocide against Rohingya. And so I'm wondering if you also see transnational organization around the development of these alternative, more democratic platforms, or other ways that people are working to integrate democratic principles into the technologies themselves.
I can try to take a stab, like a very short stab at that. Yes, I think federated technology, regional cooperatives, I think these are sort of newer areas in which, and I think that's a large body of resistance tech. And we've seen that not just now. Even if you go back about 10, 15 years, John, you'll remember back in, we had these hackathons and sort of hacking the tech in places like Berlin, the entire hacker community. That the whole creation of the hacker community was to be able to resist monopolization of tech. So it's not a moment that's unique to now. It has happened for a very long time. I think over the years, many hackers became engineers in tech companies. And so that hacker spirit, I think, was largely co-opted. But I think we are beginning to see, and it is unfortunate that we are beginning to see it because of the kind of right-wing movements that is happening as a resistance to right-wing movements happening in Europe and North America. I wish we had seen that when right movements were happening in the global majority. We did not see that, unfortunately. But now that it's a problem for another part of the world, the more elite part of the world, I think we are beginning to see these hacker groups kind of re-emerging. We are seeing digital cooperatives. We are seeing things like federated technology, Mastodon, Blue Sky. There's a number of other sort of players in this space who are trying to break it out. But I think fundamentally, it really goes back to the point that Simon has made earlier. Like, what are you building technology for, right? Is it rights respecting? Is it underpinned in the certain value systems? And what are those value systems? And I think oftentimes we understand value systems as universal, but they're not really universal. In AI, we talk a lot about ethics, for example. Ethics ethics doesn't really translate across geographies because ethics translates very differently for different jurisdictions, right? So it's not a transferable universal concept. What is ethics? What's ethical to me may not be ethical to you. And that's fundamentally is very subjective. So I think there needs to be, even when we're seeing federated technology, digital cooperatives, I think the underlying value system needs to be addressed first, and to ensure that across these various new resistance tech, that spirit of the hacker communities from, back in the day, we had those Berlin hackathons and etc. That spirit is kind of retained, that open source sort of understanding. We want to build open source tech, we want to build federated technology, but it's not just about the technology itself, but it's really about the values and making sure these values are in the public interest and broader public interest, and they are underpinned in human rights, sort of international human rights instruments. So I think that's perhaps an important way to think about it. And then in terms of transnational, I'll just quickly respond because I know we're running on time. I think the transnational piece is very interesting in the sense that, we have seen policy diffusion happen for quite some time. I mean, Bangladesh borrows half of its digital policies from India and Malaysia. We've seen that multiple times. European GDPR was transferred across the world. And we have, sort of that whole Brussels effect, which needs to be very seriously interrogated, that what has it actually led to in other different parts of the world, because Brussels exists in a sort of its own European human rights sort of frameworks, which does not exist in a place like Kenya or Bangladesh or Myanmar. So I think that policy diffusion has been both intentional and unintentional for quite some time, and perhaps there has to be a little bit more of a South-South policy sort of diffusion to happen. And what does a transnational piece look like? But I think we should also not negate the role of multilateral bodies like the UN in this space. We saw the cybercrime treaty a few months ago. We saw, large-scale UN-led processes happening that are trying to also set some rules and boundaries for how digital spaces should be governed transnationally. And I think that raises significant concerns about, one, what does it mean for state monopolization of that space? Two, what does it mean for the multi-stakeholder model versus the multilateral model? And then three, fundamentally, it goes back to the same presumptions that started the whole, war on terrorism back in the day, which led to very bad laws in different parts of the world. In paper, it looks good, but essentially these mechanisms, which is now being sort of, rubber stamped by the UN, is basically enabling unbridled data access. It's allowing cyber crimes to be treated, in a way that actually will be encroaching upon human rights. We're seeing a race to the bottom for AI. So there's a number of different things happening at that multilateral level that I think put significant concerns around what does transnational repression mean in today's world, and especially with the U.S. withdrawing from many of these negotiations, and countries like China and Russia and Iran and India kind of coming more on the forefront. I think it raises lots of serious questions about transnational mechanisms and how do countries sort of think about their agency in this kind of a sort of a environment.
Thank you. I think we do suddenly have two questions here. Let's see. The first one, there's been many instances in Bangladesh when some groups use cyberspace to spread rumors and organize mobs to attack people and vandalize public property. Given these challenges, how do you think Bangladesh can have balanced laws to protect innocent people from both misuse of laws and misuse of cyberspace in spreading rumors? I think you've been addressing that to some extent so far. So maybe I'll ask you one more. Oh, we got a couple more here. I'll lay these out, and you can sort of see if you want to take on some of these questions. What role did opposition parties play during the 15 plus years of the previous regime? It seems like the 1972 Constitution had its popularity among progressives due to the Constitution's secular principles. Do you think these then opposition parties will support keeping these principles? And then finally, given the internet shutdown in July 2024 and the ongoing tech-facilitated gender-based violence in Bangladesh, what could be the first step towards adopting a rights-based approach to cyber issues rather than just focusing on cybersecurity?
I would like to answer the internet shutdown issue first.
Okay.
Unfortunately,
I'm sorry to interrupt. We're running on time, so I'd like to request to wrap up within 1 minute, and if you could answer in chat, it would be really good.
Okay. During the July Revolution, the internet shutdown was imposed to enhance the crimes against humanity, and the new phenomena and new thing that we found, and still the investigation is going on, and eventually, I think the government will come up with exact evidences. Second, regarding the Constitution of 1972 and etc., it's a debatable issue. That there are two major groups in Bangladesh. One group criticizes the Constitution, and other groups say that no, it's very fine. It has secularism, etc. But the idea of secularism itself is a debatable issue, and society is deeply divided into this. So maybe that will need another webinar. And third one, regarding the tech accountability, platform accountability, in Bangladesh in past, we have sensed that maybe the shadow banning is going on, although we don't have enough evidences. But certainly from some of the incidents with some of our human rights activists, now we can sense that yes, the tech platforms are very much onto shadow banning. I think the more examples will pop up, I think it will be healthy to discuss to fight these kind of things. And regarding the misinformation and disinformation, one word, one phrase, digital literacy. I do not see any other alternative than the digital literacy. Thank you.
Sorry, I said excellent and very concise. Thank you. Jeba, I believe we are at that point where we are going to take a break, maybe a little over. I want our panelists to have some time to rest. We're going to take 5 minutes, not a lot of time, and we will return. Anything else you want to add to that, Jeba?
No, We'll return at 10 a.m.
All right.
in 5 minutes.
Okay. Perfect. Thank you all. We'll be right back.
Welcome back, everyone. Our second panel will explore what it means to build a digital future grounded in equity, accountability, and rights, and examining infrastructure decisions, platform responsibility, and Bangladesh's role in shaping global tech governance. We have three excellent panelists that Dr. Del already introduced to us. I'm directly getting to the the conversation session. We have comparatively more time for this panel since we have three panelists. So we have 60 minutes for a moderated discussion, followed by a 10-minute Q&A session. My first question is for Dina. I am curious to know about how, under past administrations, Bangladesh has seen repeated internet shutdowns during protests and periods of political unrest. I was wondering, could you speak broadly about these incidents and reflect on how infrastructure level decisions such as state directed shutdowns or throttling of internet services have impacted civil liberties and democratic accountability? Looking ahead, could you draw examples from other countries maybe that have placed regulatory frameworks to prevent such abuse of power? What kinds of accountability mechanisms do you think should be established to prevent the misuse of these tools? We have 10 minutes for each question.
Thank you, Jeva. Thank you. So, when I participate in panels and discussions like these, there's a phrase I often return to because I think it captures the profound truth of our digital lives at the moment, and that's internet infrastructure becomes visible when it fails. And I think this simple statement points to a critical reality, one that resonates deeply in Bangladesh and much of the global south. For most of us, the digital world feels intangible. We scroll through social media, we stream videos, we send messages, we join online meetings like these and organize events, all with incredible ease and speed. But we rarely pause to think about the complex and often invisible infrastructure that supports these everyday activities. We rarely consider the vast networks of fiber optic cables buried underground or undersea, the cell towers that punctuate our skylines, the internet exchange points where data routes intersect, or the policies and technical standards that govern how data flows and how networks operate. And I think these are the hidden gears of our digital world, without which none of our online interactions would be possible. And yet these systems remain largely invisible until the moment they stop working, until the signal drops, and not by accident, but by deliberate government action. The infrastructure that connects millions is just switched off. In Bangladesh, internet shutdowns have become a recurring political tool. Over the years, we've seen successive governments sever connectivity during protests, elections, and periods of unrest. In July 2024, the student-led demonstrations led to the authorities imposing a nationwide internet blackout for over a week. And this wasn't a technical failure, it was a deliberate, calculated act, digital curtain, so to speak, to drown out silence, obscure police violence, and limit public coordination, precisely when transparency is needed the most. And this is part of a troubling pattern where decisions are made behind closed doors, a verbal order is passed from ministry to telecom operator, and there's no legal explanation, no public notice, and no independent review. And the result is that millions of people are cut off from work, education, communication. So let's be clear, these are not neutral technical measures, they're political acts with far-reaching human consequences. When the internet is shut down, it's not just tweets and TikToks that go dark, it's families unable to go to check in on one another during the unrest. It's gig workers unable to complete deliveries, it's small businesses losing customers, it's journalists cut off from their sources, and it's emergency responders operating blindly. In 2022 alone, I believe, global internet shutdowns caused $24 billion in economic losses. And in Bangladesh, where digital services are central to the livelihoods of millions, the costs are deeply personal and disproportionately borne by low-income and marginalized communities. Beyond economics, these shutdowns rob people of voice, agency, and participation. And while the UN Human Rights Council has clearly stated that any restriction on access must meet the principles of necessity, legality, and proportionality, shutdowns in Bangladesh routinely fail on all three counts. Too often, the justification is wrapped in the language of national security, but in practice, that often means protests are reframed as instability, critical journalism is labeled as a threat, and access to information becomes a liability. What makes shutdowns especially dangerous is not just their impact, but how easily they can be imposed. In many countries, and including Bangladesh, a small number of actors within the government and telecom industry can effectively flip the switch on the entire country. No parliamentary debate, no judicial oversight, no public consultation. And so when control is centralized and transparency is absent, the digital infrastructure we rely on stops being a platform for upholding people's human rights. It becomes an instrument of repression. Contrast this with other countries. While, I'm not going to stand here and say that they're perfect, they have made maybe some progress. And I say all of this with a pinch of salt, so please take it that way. But, in India, while shutdowns have been frequent, courts have increasingly challenged their illegality, particularly, for example, after the Kashmir blackout in 2019. In Kenya, civil society organizations successfully pushed for greater oversight during election periods. And in Germany and Estonia, any policy decisions affecting digital rights undergoes multi-stakeholder consultations that include civil society, technical experts, as well as independent experts. And I think Bangladesh needs similar reforms rooted in accountability, in transparency, and in human rights. I think if we want to protect fundamental rights to free expression, to access information, the right to peaceful assembly, we need a clear and enforceable legal and regulatory framework that strictly governs when and how internet shutdowns can be imposed. Because we face three sort of fundamental problems, and one is the opacity, where decisions are made behind closed doors. The second is accountability, where there's no legal scrutiny or remedy, and centralized control, where a handful of actors can disconnect millions. So I guess the next things I want to talk about is, what does need to change? And first, I would say that shutdowns must be governed by the law, not by informal requests. Every shutdown must have a clear legal basis, publicly documented, and consistent with international human rights law. And, no more vague references to security or undefined threats. Second, independent judicial review must be mandatory. No single executive actor should have the power to disconnect an entire country. Courts must have the authority to evaluate shutdown decisions in real time and retrospectively. Third, telecom operators should be required to publish their shutdown orders, just like we get environmental impact assessments or procurement disclosures. We need to know the origin and the legal justification of the order, the geographic scope and duration, the technical methods used. Was it throttling? Was it IP blocking? Fourth, public notification must be mandatory. People deserve to know when and why their access has been restricted and for how long. Fifth, we must establish an independent oversight body. And I think this should include legal experts, technologists, and civil society who can review shutdowns before and after they occur and publish findings on the harm, on the legality, and the lessons learned. And finally, there must be legal recourse for those affected. Anyone whose rights or livelihood are harmed must have a legal pathway to seek remedies. So in Bangladesh, as in many parts of the world, internet infrastructure remains invisible until the government switches it off. It's only in the moments of silence during protests, elections, and crises that we truly understand how deeply our rights are intertwined with connectivity. When the signal drops, so do the tools of our civic engagement, the ability to organize, to bear witness, to speak truth to power, and to access information. The invisibility of internet infrastructure is one reason why it often escapes democratic oversights. Decisions are made in technical bodies, private boardrooms, or security ministries with little input from civil society or marginalized communities. Yet those decisions determine whether the internet is open or closed, whether it enables rights or reinforces oppression. I think recognizing this is a first step towards meaningful accountability. If we want an internet that supports democratic participation and upholds human dignity, then we must make this infrastructure more visible. We have to treat internet shutdowns not as routine administrative measures, but as exceptional last resort interventions that are subject to the highest standards of necessity, legality, and proportionality. And to ensure this principle holds, we must demand legal safeguards, greater transparency in government decision-making, and robust accountability mechanisms. So, ultimately, a rights-respecting digital future depends not just on the technologies themselves, but on the political will to govern them in the public interest. Thanks.
Thank you, Dina, for this compelling overview. I have a follow-up question for you since you have been discussing the internet shutdown during political unrest, and we have seen in last July 2024, during the student-led protest in Bangladesh, there has been a nationwide internet shutdown that lasted over a week, which severely restricted access to information and communication, and also suffered the economy of the country. But at that time, satellite internet services such as Starlink were not yet operational in the country. But the interim government has announced plans to adopt such technologies to prevent future disruptions, if I am not wrong. Given this context, do you think satellite internet can actually be a game changer in this context? Could you speak to how satellite internet can contribute to safeguarding freedom of expression and access to information? What are the key opportunities and risks in this context?
Well, I only have 10 minutes, so I don't have a lot of time to maybe go into all the risks and opportunities and provide a comprehensive overview, but I will try. I would say at a first glance, satellite internet, particularly low Earth orbit systems like Starlink, appear to offer a safeguard against the kind of top-down control of the internet we've witnessed in Bangladesh. And so I think it's tempting to frame satellite internet as a kind of digital lifeboat. After all, it bypasses terrestrial infrastructure such as fiber optic cables and telecom towers and ISP backbones, all of which governments can seize, throttle, or switch off. And in theory, satellite internet makes it harder for a single actor to flip the switch. That's the promise anyway. But I guess I want to challenge us to interrogate that promise more deeply because satellite internet doesn't operate in a vacuum. It's embedded within, global systems of capital, geopolitical influence, and technical realities. And while it may sidestep one form of control, it may simultaneously introduce new ones that are less visible but equally consequential. And so, we often talk about shutdowns as censorship, but they're also control over economic flows. In Bangladesh, the shutdown in 2024 didn't just silence protesters, it disrupted livelihoods, it disrupted the economy. So it's not surprising that the interim government, immediately after the unrest, accelerated these negotiations with Starlink. Not, in my opinion, as a human rights measure, but as an economic stabilizer. Here, satellite internet becomes, in my opinion, a risk management tool for the state, meant to uphold, investor confidence, guarantee continuity of the economy. And while this may inadvertently safeguard freedom of expression, it's not necessarily motivated by democratic principles. And if we're not careful, we risk celebrating resilience that's rooted in market logic and not human rights. Let's talk about who really has access and control in the context of satellite internet. Starlink, it's not just a communication service, it's a US-based private enterprise, deeply entwined with the American defense and industrial ecosystem. Satellites can be remotely controlled by authorities or telecom operators. They can be turned off. They can be geofenced, confined to a specific area. They can be routed through alternative networks, often without users and government knowledge or consent. And I think this makes them powerful tools for enforcing shutdowns or surveillance because the entire infrastructure stack is under the jurisdiction of US law and subject to US foreign policy. So from a technical standpoint, this means that Bangladesh does not own or control the infrastructure through which its citizens' data travels. When someone uses satellite internet like Starlink, their data doesn't go directly to local internet infrastructure providers. Instead, it's sent uplinked from the user terminal to a satellite in orbit. And from there, the satellite then beams data down to the ground stations, which may be located in foreign countries and operated by private companies. And only then does the data enter the broader internet, bypassing national infrastructure and regulatory oversight. In India, for example, the government forced Starlink to stop accepting pre-orders until it secured a license. Why? Because encrypted satellite communication could bypass state monitoring systems, especially in politically sensitive regions like Kashmir. That's quite important. I think this dependency raises questions about regulatory jurisdiction and accountability. Satellite internet operates across borders, complicating national oversight, creating potential vulnerabilities to surveillance, data privacy, and political pressure from external governments. And yet, Bangladesh, despite having far less regulatory capacity, has sort of moved ahead without a coherent or even enforceable strategy. The regulatory body, the BTRC, the Bangladesh Telecommunication Regulatory Commission, they're structured to manage traditional spectrum licensing for mobile networks, not to oversee or audit foreign operated satellite systems that bypass national infrastructure and beam, the internet essentially directly to remote communities without relying on local intermediaries. So the result is a jurisdictional void. Starlink becomes not just a workaround to terrestrial censorship, but a relocation of power from state regulators to corporate policy departments. And so what we call resilience may, in fact, be disempowerment and trading one form of control for another. Let's also examine the technical accessibility of satellite internet. In theory, satellite internet should be a great equalizer, offering rural communities, marginalized populations, the same digital opportunities as those in urban centers. But in practice, it's prohibitively expensive. In Kenya, the Starlink service is subsidized to under $10 a month. In Zambia and Rwanda, it's $30. In Bangladesh, current estimates put monthly service at over $100, with a setup fee of $600 just for the hardware. And that's more than twice the national average monthly income. Technically speaking, the Starlink hardware itself, the antenna, is highly advanced, right? But it's also fragile. It requires a clear line of sight to the sky. It draws around 100 watts of power continuously. That's more than any household can afford to power reliably during outages. So who will actually use it? Not the student live streaming a protest and not the rural health worker trying to send data. Likely, it'll be gated to those with existing access to reliable infrastructure, urban elites, corporate entities. And I think in this way, satellite internet risks reinforcing a two-tiered system, one where meaningful connectivity remains out of the hands of those who need it the most. I'm coming to my final point, so bear with me. But the central policy challenge is that we treat internet shutdowns as technical disruptions that require technical fixes. But in reality, shutdowns are acts of state power, deliberate political decisions aimed at information control. They're not engineering failures, they're governance failures. And yet we often respond with technical solutions. We reach for circumvention tools, virtual private networks, mesh networks, and now satellite internet. And these tools, I think, can be powerful stopgaps. I think they can mitigate harm. They can allow for human rights defenders to document abuses, enable journalists to publish and preserve communication during moments of repression or conflict. But I think the danger is that if we invest in satellite internet without also reforming the political culture, the legal and the institutional frameworks that permit shutdowns in the first place, we're treating the symptom and not the disease. And we risk accepting the false notion that resilience means finding workarounds, right? Rather than addressing the root problem, that internet shutdowns should not happen in the first place. So can satellite internet safeguard freedom of expression and access to information? Yes, it might be possible, but only if we govern it well. I think without robust legal frameworks, democratic accountability, and inclusive policy design, we risk replacing one form of centralized control with another. And this time we're embedded within opaque corporate structures and complex transnational dependencies that we don't truly understand. So yeah, the satellites, they might orbit above us, but the consequences of how we govern them will be felt here on the ground and by the people. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much for your reflection on satellite internet. Now, I would like to turn to Christabel and Samaya with my next set of questions. I have two questions for both of you. My first question is, in your view, what responsibilities do you think foreign tech companies or major digital platforms like Meta have in supporting Bangladesh's transition towards right-respecting digital governance? Specifically, we can see the increasing reliance on AI for content moderation and algorithmic curation. How can these platforms be held accountable when their inaction, lack of transparency, or a driven system have historically contributed to the spread of disinformation or online violence or digital repression in general? Additionally, what role can technical standards and governance frameworks play in ensuring that digital infrastructure supports rather than suppresses democratic freedoms? Christabel, would you like to go first? Then we can hear from someone.
Great. Thank you so much. And thank you for having me. I enjoyed the first panel and especially Dina debunking all the techno-solutionism that comes as a first, as a first response to many of the problems that we see. There's a lot of questions bundled there, but I would like to center my response under three principles: fairness, transparency, and accountability. The first response was, what role does Meta or any tech platform have? I'd like to sort of reframe that. I don't think we should so readily abdicate governance to private governance or bespoke governance in corporate structures. Governance is essentially a public function. And as we've all been talking about, those institutions, those mechanisms need to be strengthened. We need to have those robust systems in place. Your laws are only as good as the institutions that implement them, that enforce them, and oversee them. And whether it's Meta, whether it's X, or whatever social media. I also take issue with the term platform because it implies some kind of neutrality, which is not. Their communication services, their social media services, their online media services, and we need to first develop governance systems, public governance capacity, and public governance principles that are able to oversee these systems. They should be fair in the sense that tech companies, even during the Awami League regime, during Sheikh Hasina's government, we've seen they ignored a lot of the instructions to provide any kind of accountability. So it's not just a question about what role do they have? It's about how do we develop capacity to govern them. They should not, so for example, you shouldn't get any less or unfair or different treatment because you are demanding accountability from these platforms. And oftentimes we've seen that content moderation policies of Meta are different in the EU and it's different in the US and it's different in other jurisdictions. We've also seen these platforms virtually ignore legal mandates in certain jurisdictions unless it really comes to a situation where there is where there's personal danger of probably executives in those countries. And yes, I'm not underplaying those, but I'm also saying that the impunity or unfairness with which they have grown accustomed to operate is the first thing that needs to be addressed through our own public governance institutions. Secondly, the word transparency has been so fundamental and has been recurring even in this public discussion, even in this panel discussion that we've had. What does it really mean in the context of these online communication systems, right? Or these media services? What does transparency mean? And you mentioned that AI is increasingly being used for content moderation. This is not new. These tools have developed through algorithmic tools. But what is really required is algorithmic transparency. All these online services, online, social media, they use algorithms to label, to order, to disseminate content, right? And we need to develop first laws, whether it's in the form of data privacy laws, whether it's in the form of government oversight bodies, as well as technical capacity, right? Dina, Simon and Dia have all talked about, do we really have the people who have the technical understanding to be able to address these issues? So why is Meta showing certain content to a certain population? Why are certain voices being amplified? Why is it being concentrated in certain region? These are all the functioning of recommender systems that are powered by there's a large economy behind it. There are political actors, there are commercial actors, there's a monetization sort of framework that underlies it. And what governments can do is mandate algorithmic transparency. For example, in the US, a lot of this is being challenged as, compelled disclosure. But if you are using an online service to sort of content is actually a product because you're earning revenue because of the content that you're displaying and you're distributing, then the government should have the authority and must develop the capacity to require that transparency and disclosure. So how content is being labeled, how it is being ordered, how it is being ranked, how it is being distributed, that algorithmic transparency mandate must come in first through laws, and secondly, it must come through institutions and technical capacity of those institutions to be able to enforce that. And more importantly, accountability. I can understand our urgency to have some sort of ex ante solution or some sort of preemptive solution to all of these things. But oftentimes the preemptive solution is having the public governance infrastructure. That means having the laws, it means having the capacity, but oftentimes accountability does come after the fact. So what does that mean? It means that if there has been some sort of weaponization of an information system that has led to violence, or that has led to a particular outcome, that there should be an accountability process. And yes, we've heard of meta oversight boards, we've heard of, a process of appeals that has been set out, where you can refer certain issues to an oversight board and have them decide on the moderation policy that will be applied to a specific piece of content, whether it be a meme or whether it be something related to a COVID vaccine or some other issue. But meta oversight board should not be, or those kind, I'm using it as an example, but those kind of oversight mechanisms should not be a substitute of the government being able to demand accountability, and it should not be a substitute for meaningful redress, which means that if there has been, we've seen, especially since 2024 was election year globally, many jurisdictions have had elections. We've seen certain regulations come into force as well. Micro-targeting is weaponized, especially during these sensitive periods. In the European Union, for example, they have introduced a sort of temporary moratorium where even foreign, whether of the purchasing of political advertisements, especially by political actors. And what accountability means is, if there is something that transpires, whether it's election interference or whether it's in the time of a public health and safety crisis like COVID, that the government has the ability to seek accountability as to why this transpired, that there is the ability to audit that occurrence and those systems, and then take a decision. And of course, there should, again, transparency not just on the online services, but transparency also in the way these decisions are taken, which means that individuals should be informed of these processes. They should have a right, and they should have ways of accessing a remedy which is beyond what just a Meta or an X or any of these services choose to offer. There should be a fair process for all individuals to access, which is part of the public governance system. So again, fairness, transparency, and accountability, again, which we see is so critical for democratic functioning, is something that must be reflected in the way we try to address the risks and benefits of these online systems.
I can pick up here, actually. Thank you, Christabel. It's and Dina, excellent points, both of you, and it's always nice to be part of a women-led panel. So I am in agreement with everything that has been said. So my responses will mostly be supplementing, and also I'll comment a little bit on the approach that the interim government has been taken and the gaps that there are, and try to sort of place them in a comparative analysis with what else has been going on in the region more broadly. So over the past decade, and I will speak to the past decade because under the Awami League regime, things have developed and changed. And it was also around the same time that digitalization increased in Bangladesh and in most parts of the world. So there have been systematic efforts, right, to centralize the digital infrastructure in the community, in the country, and something that allowed the government to monitor, intercept, block access to the internet at the push of a button, metaphorically speaking, as Dina said, but very, very true. We have company responsibility on the one hand, which is a separate area that we can take an hour alone to discuss. But on the other hand, and what is most immediately of concern to myself as well as my organization is how the government has been responding, because we had a lot of hopes for the interim government, and there are still opportunities and windows of opportunities and moments left to perhaps pick up on things. So first things first is that what should have been the approach that the interim government takes is starting with a formal and public inquiry into the structural problems related to digital rights. What has been the reality is very sporadic and arbitrary sort of efforts to reform and random pieces of the law, the cybersecurity law, and then the data protection law for a bit was under scrutiny. The Telecommunication Act did not really sort of make it into larger public discourse. But what happened was that for varying reasons, it initially started with the government trying to reform the cybersecurity law in order to address the shutdowns. And the result was that at a very surface level, in the draft that was published formally on the official website, it included a right to internet shutdown as part of the definition of cybersecurity, basically. And as we all know, and we have legal experts in the room who I think will agree that a definition does not have legal force unless you design the law to implement it, for it to have effect. And this is something, this kind of speaks to the broader issue of how the government approached reforming the law. We have one draft that was officially published, but behind the scenes, there have been several, and there have been a lot of back and forths, and even consultations that took place were regarding laws that were not officially gazetted or published or made public in any form. Like Diapo mentioned in the first panel, it is not due process to just call up your friends and family and ask them about a certain law and seek their thoughts. You have to take certain steps to make sure communities, minorities especially, are included. We did not see a lot of organizations or individuals from the Chittagong Hill Tracts be part of these discussions. Now, will this law or any amendments to any law solve the issue of internet shutdown in Bangladesh? Perhaps not, because from a more technical perspective, for example, and this I'm using the example of internet shutdown, but this applies largely to other online and digital services, including for content moderation. But sticking to our internet shutdown example, we have there's an excellent ISP diversity in Bangladesh, internet service provider diversity, over 100, as was last reported in 2023 by our colleagues at Internet Society. But all these internet service providers go through national gateways, and the government ensured that there are that traffic can be effectively monitored and controlled by mandating 2 or perhaps 2 to 3 specific gateways that would allow internet traffic to flow through. And that is something that people will not understand, the general public will not understand unless you take effective measures to make it clear, to be transparent about what the current state of the digital infrastructure is. The same applies to sort of online services. We spoke about the Meta and other digital platforms in Bangladesh. If we have responsibilities that are assigned to platforms 100%, but largely and infrastructurally or technically, what is the case is that governments have a lot of authority and control over how these social media companies are allowed to operate. And there is significant pressure involved. Across the region, more in South and Southeast Asia, we're seeing this pretty concerning emergence of digital laws or provisions that at GNI we refer to as hostage-taking laws. By that I mean companies are required to establish local offices and also allocate or nominate one individual who will be held criminally responsible if they fail to comply with government pressures. And now in Bangladesh, we don't have one particular law that is hostage taking. However, and under the previous regime, a lot of this happened extra legally. The government didn't need a reason or a legal framework to justify what they were doing. There were pressure that companies were under, and to the extent that companies have the responsibility of informing their users about certain content takedowns or internet shutdown requests from the government, they are allowed to do that to the extent that their local staff members are not at risk. And there are several dynamics here at play. Sometimes, as is the case right now, I'll use a recent example in India and Pakistan. The Indian government sent legal notices to Google, Meta, to take down Pakistan content, to block anything that essentially any traffic from Pakistan. And companies have a responsibility to let their users know. But these legal notices came with non-disclosure obligations. And if that is something that companies did not comply with, their local staff would be at risk. So we do talk about responsibility of all actors. And in order for all these actors or stakeholders to be able to deconstruct and be assigned their responsibility or be able to exercise their responsibility for transparency, accountability, everything, then the government right now needed to ensure that whatever reforms they're making, not just with the cybersecurity and data protection laws, but also with the policy reform document that came out. The government introduced Starlink, and soon after we have the BTRC publish a regulatory guideline which mandated satellite operators to establish national gateways, which means that traffic had to pass through locally before the internet can be connected. And these are difficult and very complex. The internet, the tech sector is generally a very dynamic, robust, and complex field. And in the past regime, under the past regime, we did not have the government did not consult with human rights advocates, as Simon I mentioned. They did not consult with civil society. And under this government, we are largely and primarily consulting with civil society and civil society activists, artists, which is excellent. But at the same time, we're leaving the industry and technologists and industry experts out of a lot of these conversations. There's a lot of back channeling that's happening. So I've been talking for a while, but the intention for all of this was to point out larger gaps within the infrastructure that the interim government has not taken any active and effective measures to address. It was more of surface level reforms that they've been approaching. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, it does. Thank you so much. I think Christopher has some follow-up question. Please go
Yeah,
ahead.
I just wanted to supplement excellent points made by Samaya, and just like looping back to what Dina said as well. Governments should not also have a blanket authority to issue legal notices. Again, it must come under, there must be a reasoned analysis underlying why a legal notice is issued. So that really demonstrate that there has been a determination of a public emergency or a real determination of a national security issue, and it's necessary and proportionate. And these are democratic rights-based principles that should be reflected in terms of accountability from these private actors as well. And I think with the interim government, because of the 15 years, I loved when Dia said that we forgot to exercise our rights, right? And perhaps now that we're trying to exercise those rights, there's also a large expectation on the interim government to take a lot of measures. But just as we say, justice hurried is justice denied. I think reform hurried is also reform denied. And there should be priority on institution building, which was weaponized and which was disintegrated, and something that we see across fragile democracies, rather than not all reforms are going to be achieved in a one-year period, and neither should that be the goal.
Thank you. I want to have more time for audience question answer. And if you would like to follow up or add on to each other's discussion, but I do have one last question for both of you. I'm curious to know, like, since Bangladesh is now rebuilding itself, how do you think Bangladesh can assert greater agency in global leadership or the global policy conversations, particularly being the voice of global South, or we are hearing the term of global majority these days? If you could also explain a little bit about global majority and how can Bangladesh exercise more leadership in digital policy conversations globally?
Well, Christabel, would you like to go first?
No, I think you take a stab at this first. I think I'm more concerned about building our own agency and then global agency,
Yeah.
but no.
That was actually what I would have mentioned as well. But if we do want to take more, I don't think leadership at this stage should be a goal. We need a lot more capacity building within the country in order to achieve that. But what they can do is, under the previous regime, we had, so there's a lot going on, a lot of internet governance related process in the international stage. We have the World Summit for Information Society, we have the Internet Governance Forum, and there are also regional conversations. We have excellent and important conferences, the Digital Rights Asia Pacific, and I'm sure I'm forgetting a bunch of others, that previously the individuals who did attend these conferences or introduce local chapters of these international processes were pretty much monopolized, and the government had broadly control over how these mechanisms operated. And that is, again, something that we need to, well, at least this interim government needs to be aware of, acknowledge, and sort of try to fix or remedy. In some ways, but when I say remedy, I'll reiterate Christabel's point from earlier. Within a 1 year, it shouldn't be our goal to change everything within a 1 year period. It's not a very realistic goal, but we can take steps to lay out the blueprint for what needs to continue happening even after this interim period is over. So I'll let Christabel add anything.
I understand that there is, of course, we don't live, we're not isolated, we don't live in a bubble. We are a part of this global community, and we have this interaction, especially the digital space is by its nature a global space. And I can understand this aspiration or this to have a voice, but sometimes there's nothing wrong in being a listener as well. And I think it's important for Bangladesh to, at this stage, really look at lessons, not at this stage, but actually it's a continuing process. The best part I see of these global interactions and dialogues that we have is the opportunity to take lessons. Oftentimes in this part of the world, we, tend to suffer from some sort of a complex that we're missing out on, this wonderful world of technology. Why don't we have AI? Why don't we have an open AI? Why don't we have a Starlink? But I think we have the benefit of learning from the mistakes of others. And I think that's what we should be trying to learn and trying to avoid. In terms of what we need to do is really a lot of capacity building in whether it's governance, whether it's in our public consultation processes, as Simon said, digital literacy. Does the Bangladeshi population even know to distinguish between a bot online and a person online? You can require online services to label and put disclosures when something is AI generated, or to have those disclosure practices, and there should be there. But you also need to develop the capacity of the people to distinguish between what is a bot and what is a human. So a lot more focus needs to come in our own capacity building, whether it's in digital literacy, whether it's in having the right kind of technical capacity and the right kind of governance. And we should use these global platforms to negotiate better transfer of capacity and not just export of technology from one jurisdiction to another, but really negotiate transfer of capacity through these global frameworks. And a lot of this, I think something that came up in the first panel was development aid, export of technology actually being couched as development aid. Again, public procurement processes need to be really robust, there needs to be a public process, and any kind of independent oversight that we establish needs to have socio-technical capacity, needs to have that intersectional participation where you have civil society, where you have technologists, where you have researchers, where you have people from the government and also people from the industry. And those are the kinds of capacity building that we should be focused on and use the global forums to negotiate more transfer of capacity and not just transfer of technology.
Thank you. Thank you so much, both of you. Now, I'd like to invite Dr. Dill again to moderate our final question and answer segment. I can see some question in the chat from Simon to Christopher and Samaya. Dr. Dill, would you like to take over?
Sure. Yeah, Simon's asking specific question to Christabel. In automated decision-making, in government services and decision-making, how can we reflect democratic practice?
So first, because I think we talk a lot about AI and automated decision making, the first baseline that I would draw is, where do we really need automated decision making? So it's actually, again, coming back to Dina's point about techno-solutionism, the first responsibility of a government to understand is where they're going to really use an automated technology and what kind of impacts that's going to have on their constituents and on on the public interest and on public trust, and then decide. So first is, do I need an automated decision-making system or not? That is the first democratic public trust question to ask. Secondly is, if I do decide that I want to automate processes, and there's been a real thrust towards having a digital Bangladesh, and there's nothing wrong with that. But secondly, then the second layer of questioning is, how are these processes being designed? Not just technology, how are the processes being designed? Because as you mentioned, it's a decision-making process. The technology is just to facilitate that decision-making or to facilitate that service delivery. How is it being designed? Where is this technology coming from? Not just, is it technologically sound? Is it robust in terms of cybersecurity? Is it robust in terms of, accuracy? Because algorithms tend to adapt and perform differently over a period of time. So assessing whether that technology that we are seeking to procure or seeking to deploy is robust, but also really getting, again, coming back to the public consultation process, informing public that this is how it's a change management process. So how are we deploying automated decision making? For what purpose? How is it going to impact you? And then having a feedback loop where you come back and you hear from people who are being affected by that system, that exactly what are the outcomes they are producing. And this is democracy is not a frictionless process. It's not some kind of utopian process. There will be friction, but by ensuring these fundamental principles of transparency and accountability, we can at least drive the process towards something that is, again, in the public interest and not and builds resilience towards being weaponized, builds resilience towards increasing surveillance. I think automated decision making, we see that a lot. We see governments all over the world automating all kinds of public services, but whether it's from the decision to automate to the procurement of the system, to the deployment of the system, and to the administration of the system, that entire process must happen in a transparent and accountable way. And if there is a decision that is negatively impacting or prejudicing, whether it's an individual, whether it's a community, whether it's the delivery of a service, there must be a review process, a remedy process to ensure that accountability.
Excellent. Thank you. I liked your earlier comment that I think is related too, where you said you don't like using the term platform because it implies some kind of neutrality. And in a sense, I think I hear you saying not only are these digital technologies embedded in social relations, but social relations are embedded in the technology, and we need to understand how that's an iterative, reiterative process. And then how can we avoid, as members of civil society, depending just on corporations or states, to design our public for us, right? So if we have stakeholders and we're a part of that, there's concerns about capture. Are we helping to just legitimate their policies? So we do need to be informed, educated, as you said, and that's difficult under conditions of extreme inequality. We're dealing with that here in our country. So I appreciate these comments. Thank you very much. I think we have one more question. Let's see. This one is for Samaya, and this is also from Saimam. Can GNI be an effective alternative to multinational treaty bodies to bring platforms under accountability, or should we be advocating for a global multilateral treaty body, despite the fact there's concern that the so-called international law seems vague in post-Ukraine war?
I'll start by saying that we think once we've introduced a framework for accountability, or when I say framework, I mean policy or regulations, there's a sense that the there's a sense of achievement which very quickly turns into disappointment, because there's, to be very honest, that we don't, there's no gap in, well, there are several gaps in regulations, but we have laws emerging, right and left, addressing the same things in um, similar ways to each other, and ultimately there, like, the oversight mechanism fails because one, technology keeps changing. Two, um, because it's difficult to sustain these mechanisms. And thirdly, because what works in one jurisdiction does not in others, and platforms have different effects in different places. Apologies for using the term platform. It's always right at the top of your head, but you make a very fair point, Christopher. Just for a little bit of clarity, a GNI is a multi-stakeholder organization. So we work with companies. We have company members, including Meta, Google, Ericsson, Nokia, Telenor. We have civil society. From Bangladesh. We have TGI, who's a member and a very valuable member. Article 19 is also a member. And we also work with investors and academics. And the organization itself works on various planes. There's policy advocacy, which is the area that I work on. We also work on accountability, which is companies go through independent assessment processes. We go through a round of case selection. Bangladesh has been nominated as cases several times. And we tried to analyze how companies responded to certain government demands for data, for internet shutdown, anything that essentially violates people's freedom of expression or privacy. We try to understand how companies responded, what they could have done better, and that is an assessment process. It stretches out over a period of 4 years for every cycle. GNI is a multi-stakeholder organization, and multilateralism is a completely different area that I speak both from our organization as well as personally. We don't want states to take control over more things. We need individual actors, and we need artists, we need activists, we need rights, people working in the rights spaces, and not just in digital rights, because there is we come across this often, that like policy communities are often like there are bubbles, they exist within separate bubbles. So digital rights folks don't always communicate with child rights folks or gender and minorities. So we need more people to come together. There is an international level process that happens, which is the IGF that I mentioned earlier. But if we want platform accountability, there are legislations, there are frameworks in the international level. We need to make use of existing frameworks before we resort to new options. There is the UN guiding principles. We have the OECD principles for multinational enterprises, and these have been developed for a long time, and to apply to, and to, like, they've been developed in a way that can be applied in context specific cases, in context sensitive manners, which context sensitivity is often missing, but if applied in the right way, they can serve as useful frameworks for analysis and understanding. And GNI, we work at a global scale. We also work on individual countries, and have engaged with Bangladesh, as well as other countries within the region, especially under authoritarian countries under authoritarian regimes like Vietnam, where things are a lot more difficult. Bangladesh has an excellent and unique opportunity, while our neighbors kind of backslide um, in democracy and other areas of human rights. I won't. I don't think the approach, the question should be that do we need a one body overlooking platform accountability as a whole? That should not be the approach. Rather, as I mentioned, with internet digital internet infrastructure, we need to diversify the infrastructure in the same way that we need to diversify accountability mechanisms. So I hope that answers your question, Simon Pai. But I am skeptical about multilateral institutions. Well, thank you.
Thank you. Christabel, do you want to, do you have anything to say to that?
I share Samaya's healthy skepticism. I think, very often we look, when we were looking at the data privacy, data protection laws that were proposed in Bangladesh, 2 drafts, I'm not aware if there's a third or a fourth draft. There's a tendency to sort of replicate the EU's GDPR and again, the Brussels effect. The reason why the GDPR works in Europe is because Europe has a European Convention of Human Rights. They have a European Court of Human Rights, and there's a very unique legal and institutional framework within which those laws operate. Is it good? Is it bad? There are critiques on both sides. The tech companies hate it, but European citizens, for the most part, seem to be quite content with it. What model really would be applicable for Bangladesh? We're talking about internet infrastructure, we're talking about surveillance, we're talking about internet shutdown, we're talking about content moderation and disinformation. We don't have the laws to secure citizens' data. We don't have laws. We have a guarantee to freedom of expression. We have constitutional protection for privacy of thought in our constitution. But do we really have a statutory framework to supplement that, independent oversight to protect that, and more importantly, technical capacity to enforce that, right? We talked about whether you call it cybersecurity or cyber safety. There were a lot of content-related provisions included in those laws, and why would a cyber safety ordinance even have? So we need to resist this urge to sort of regulate speech. Of course, there should be boundaries of drawn in terms of hateful speech, but those need to come under really clear transparent processes and constitutional guarantees, an assessment, if at all. With regard to tech systems and coming back to AI, I think it's important to have certain bright lines, and that's red lines are something that we don't talk about in our countries. Should we have public services or digital? Should we move towards a form of digital existence where there's mass amounts of biometric information, biometric categorization that enables surveillance, that enables scoring, and we've seen that with the national identity program that Bangladesh implemented, which was great, which was actually meant to ensure that voters are registered. That then became a national ID that was integrated into a lot of other systems. And digital public infrastructure is something that is being discussed a lot in many forums. And Bangladesh is also really looking towards strengthening digital public infrastructure. But do we then have the right kind of privacy and cybersecurity safeguards to ensure that that DPI is not weaponized and does not fuel surveillance and does not entrench state control in undesirable forms. I think these are really important questions to keep having, important issues to keep interrogating towards developing both that governance and oversight capacity and public engagement capacity.
Thank you. This is a question for Dina. I agree. This is from Simon Malsa. I agree with your opinion that tech policies should be based on human rights principles. However, the UN system developed through the horrific experience of World War II is often criticized that it has introduced the Universal Declaration of Human Rights without effective mechanisms to enforce it. Enforcement of human rights is greatly subject to so-called state sovereignty. How do you overcome such complexity to implement or enforce human rights principles? That's a softball question for you, Dina.
Yeah, super soft. Thank you. I'm no legal scholar or anything like that, so I will try to answer in a scholarly way as best I can. Yeah, I think you're right to sort of point out the tension between the universality of human rights and the realities, especially of state sovereignty, especially now in this, political climate that we're in. And I think, this has kind of been one of the core limitations of the international human rights system, whether it's the UN or the resolution it proposes or the laws that it's supposed to uphold. I think, these mechanisms like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, they do clearly articulate clear, moral and legal standards, but they lack robust enforcement mechanisms, especially when states assert sovereignty to resist that external scrutiny. And I think, in the digital age with all these technologies being deployed and developed, the problem becomes more pronounced. Technologies transcend borders, but human rights violations like surveillance, censorship, algorithmic discrimination, happen within national jurisdictions where international mechanisms may not be as effective or have little reach. So, how do we move forward? I don't know that there's any sort of silver bullet. But yeah, I think we need to shift enforcement from only through international institutions, sorry, to more maybe polycentric governance. And I think that means engaging with multiple layers of accountability, national courts, regional human rights bodies, multi-stakeholder initiatives like GNI, and, maybe even corporate accountability frameworks as well. I think also, when states fail to uphold human rights, coalitions, civil society coalitions, movements like grassroots movements can put pressure, can push these bodies to adopt more rights respecting laws and resolutions. But I think one of the things I would say, especially now, because we're talking a lot about digital sovereignty these days, we need to sort of reconceptualize sovereignty itself, not as an insulation from accountability, but as a responsibility. And, there's like the UN guiding principles on business and human rights. It's soft law, but it affirms that states have the duty to protect rights and, even in digital markets. So there's also, the Global Digital Compact. We now have a UN tech envoy. So I think there's like values in pursuing binding treaties in specific areas, like, cross-border data flows or algorithmic accountability even, especially when they're championed by civil society or by coalitions of civil society, particularly from the global South. So yeah, I agree. These sort of agreements need a bit more teeth, I would say. But yeah, we can't eliminate the sovereignty dilemma overnight. We probably need this mosaic of like complementary mechanisms at domestic, regional, and international levels that pushes states and private actors towards accountability.
Thank you. I'd add too, I always try to push this when I can, but the UN's general comment on human right to science from a few years ago, when it was revisited for the first time, Article 15, presented an opportunity to update what a human right to science that has now been hitched to digital technologies might mean. And so paragraphs 73 to 75 at least address specifically the responsibilities and duties of big tech corporations. So there's a way to start linking some of these, linking this to the guiding principles and others. Again, as you say, soft law and enforcement's the big issue, but sometimes that provides a toehold for leverage in these conversations that other civil society organizations are pressing. I think we might have, we have a comment, I believe. Let's see. Are you shutting this down? Do we have time for, well, I'll say one comment here. Dia's comment. There are longstanding debates on who governs, is that it has historically been seen through the lens of governments. However, the process of policymaking involves other stakeholders and accountability mechanisms. So maybe that was just a comment in agreement with you. Jeba, is Jeba still here?
Yeah.
Oh, there you are.
Thank you so much, everyone, for this was a very insightful discussion. Is there any closing remarks from any of our panelists? Please feel free to jump in. If none, I'd like to thank all of you and everyone else who joined us today. As we have seen, the future of democracy and digital governance in Bangladesh and globally requires bold thinking, inclusive dialogue, and rights-based reform. As you all have been discussing, that reform is not just about legal text, it's about protecting people, capacity building, digital literacy, amplifying voices, and reimagining infrastructure for justice. We hope today's conversation inspired deeper engagement and concrete action. Please stay connected with Movement Engaged Research Hub, and to watch this and other webinar records, please visit our YouTube channel. I'll share the link in the chat box, and our Movement Engaged Research Hub website link as well. I would also like to request everyone to fill out the survey form that we provide at the end of the webinar. We would really appreciate your feedback. I hope you all have a great summer. Take care and goodbye for now.
Thank you.